thank you all for being back from break, relatively on time. We'll go ahead and get started here in a moment. As we know, folks will continue to trickle back. And of course, feel free to trickle out if you need some water, coffee, a bio break, whatever. But thank you all so much for being here in this session today. Again, we'll do a little bit of introductions in addition to what we just did in the circle. But my name is Laura Bartok. I use she, her pronouns. And just while we're still on this title slide, because this came up in all of the circles me and my co-presenter sat in, wanted to say just a few very short words about the words in this title, which are the basis for why you were here. So, of course, we are here talking about action ultimately, but want to be very clear that communities are not the ones leading this work. Communities are the institutions convening their partners to share leadership in doing this work. So that's why we have museums convening communities. Communities are the leaders here because they are the experts in their priorities, their needs, their interests. And when we talk about why and how, of course, in the morning, and I'll transition to our next slide here, this morning we'll be laying down some of the theoretical groundworks that underpin the work that me and my colleagues do, and sharing just a little bit of background information that might help you think about what it means to be thoughtful partners in communities. So we're going to talk about, again, some definitions. One of the themes in addition to action is environmental justice. So we're going to talk about what does environment mean in addition to what does community mean. We're going to be talking about interdisciplinary, intergenerational, and intersectional work and why that is also critical to being thoughtful collaborators. Of course, we're going to talk about what does action even mean or look like? What are some of those models for action or ideas around action that are important when you're taking the planning steps? And we're going to conclude our morning with what does it mean to be thoughtful partners with communities and sharing some examples from museum professionals. In the afternoon, we'll be very much focused on our breakout groups, where we'll be talking about a few different tools for convening communities and leading this type of action. We'll be in some larger breakout groups that will divide into some smaller breakout groups and give you plenty of time to read, interact with, and ask questions about the tools that we're bringing to you today. So, we'll wrap things up. You'll have some time to, at the end of the day, unfortunately not have a closing circle, but have some time with your teams to reflect. And then hopefully we'll see you at the happy hour. With that sort of preamble done, wanted to just, again, do some quick, short introductions to the team here. Again, I'm Laura Bartok. I think that's the fifth time I've said that. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with the Association of Science and Technology Centers, and my role there is Manager of Community Science and Special Projects. So my role is really focused on helping our members understand what it means to be thoughtful partners, to leverage science and technology and their museum resources to make positive differences in their local communities, and to really think about what does equity look like in practice. So I'm excited to be here today with my colleagues, Rose and Katrina.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, I'm Rose Hendricks. I use she, her, and I'm at the Association of Science and Technology Centers as well. I lead our Seeding Action initiative, which is designed to catalyze and support science centers, museums, and other public engagement organizations in their work to cultivate a culture of action on all of our planetary health challenges and opportunities.
Good morning, everyone. Katrina Lashley. I'm Research Coordinator at the Center for Environmental Justice at Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. We're just about to celebrate our first year in terms of the center, but I've been with the museum's Environmental Urban Waterways program for the past 12 years. Research, education, programming, a variety of things. You know, you work at a small institution, you have several roles. So very happy to be here with you all.
Thank you. And we had planned for some time for y'all to talk at your tables, but your circles were with your tables. So I think you've had an opportunity to get to know one another and share where you're from. But of course, if you haven't met somebody that is sitting across from you, introduce yourself. just want to also share a few meeting norms to help things go as smoothly as possible today. First of all, we don't want you to raise your hands because that can be very exhausting when there's many people who are trying to raise their hands. So if you'd like to get into the queue to speak, to ask a question, we ask that you just stand your name tent up on the short side so it's straight up and down like a lighthouse, and we'll know that that means that you want to contribute to the conversation. One of my favorite meeting norms is also half thoughts are welcome. You do not need to have a perfectly formed question or comment in order to contribute to the conversation. Often someone has the other half of that thought. You'll spark somebody else's idea and keep the conversation going. And again, we know these are our long days. We have built in a couple of short breaks in addition to our longer breaks. But if there's at any point you need to get up and stretch, again, get a drink, get a snack, use the bathroom, you are adults. You know your needs best. We will not be offended if you need to step out of the room. So I'm going to quickly switch slides here, switch screens so that we can do a quick poll together. So we have a QR code here up on the screen. You can also go to menti.com and enter this code 67859042. And that will give you access to our live poll. We'll be asking for some answers to some questions that will also be projecting up here on the screen. Once I see phones down, I'll know everybody has access and we can move on. I'm seeing some thumbs up already. Love that. So the code is also at the top if you still need to join the room. But our very first question is asking you to respond on a scale of strongly disagree to agree, these 3 questions about your relationships with communities at your institution right now. So we want to know how are you feeling? Do you have strong relationships with your communities that you're seeking some tools to support? Are you actively working on building those relationships before you can really get to the point where you're taking action together? Or are you just starting to think about this? Are you strategizing, planning, doing that important background work in order to understand what could those relationships be? Seeing those questions come in live, love that. Looks like most folks are right in the middle on many of these, which I think is helpful. I think that's going to benefit our discussions because so many of you are in different places. We're going to have plenty of opportunity for you all to share your experiences and your stories with others in the room. So for those of you who have those strong relationships, if there's somebody who's asking questions about what does it mean to start that work, feel free to weigh in and share your experience. And especially if you're just starting to build those relationships, your questions will be really important and helpful to move the conversation along. Awesome. So it does look like a lot of folks are in this middle space where you're building those relationships. You aren't necessarily satisfied with where they are right now, but you're working to strengthen and enhance those. So this is a short response. For those of you who have those relationships or are working to build them, we'd love to know how you would describe that relationship with the communities you seek to serve. I won't give you any hints about what those words might be, but would love to hear in your own words how you would characterize those relationships. Now, already starting to see some themes here: variable, varied, episodic. I see here too, some are established, some are symbiotic, some really positive relationships, project-based, disconnected, beginning, developing, all seem to be in that sort of, again, starting stages where we're trying to figure out what does it mean to not just work on one grant and then be done, but to get to those sustained relationships. Yeah, I'm seeing lopsided, not sustainable, hit and miss, challenging, program-based. But I'm also seeing consistency, burgeoning, beneficial. Again, I really appreciated the symbiotic word that I think really speaks to what we hope relationships can be between museums and communities. All right, last poll question for y'all. What would you like your relationships with communities to look like? Feel free to steal a word that you liked from the previous slide, but also would love to know your hopes, your aspirations, your dreams when it comes to building those relationships. Yeah, seeing sustainable, nice and big in the center there. I think that's something I also heard reflected in my opening circle this morning, wanting to make sure that it is not one-off, mutually beneficial. Again, getting to that symbiotic word, authentic. I think that's something that we're going to try to touch on here today. What does it mean to be authentic in your partnership? Empathetic, synergistic, fully integrated. I like that phrase too, again, not just the one-off, not program-based, but integral to the work that you do. Awesome. Well, thank you all very much for sharing your hopes, your dreams. We'll get back to our slides here. And hopefully start to answer some of the questions that you have. But for now, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Katrina to dig into what we mean when we talk about environment.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So you'll see on the screen the definition that we have when we say environment. This is what we mean: where we live, work, pray, play, and learn. For those of you who are in the EJ movement, you'll recognize this definition. That's the movement's definition of the environment. It is everything. It's where our lives unfold. I really want to take a time to kind of talk through how we as an institution got to this definition over time, through continuous conversation and collaborations with our partners that we built over the course of the year. So very quickly, to kind of situate ourselves, not only in terms of the project, but also Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has two rivers, the Potomac and the Anacostia. The Anacostia is the eastern branch of the Potomac. It divides the city between east and west. And you'll notice here, we are based in the historic community of Anacostia. There we are. And you'll see the mall is on the west side. So think about that not only in terms of geography, but also I would say sometimes approach, mentality, I guess views and relationships with the surrounding communities. So in 2010, Dr. Gail Lowe, who was senior historian at this at ACM for many, many years, was very intrigued by almost a decade of, I would say, excitement, debate, tensions around what was coming next for the Anacostia River. So DC, like many other cities, growing, stretching, looking east. There's no other room. And the Anacostia had to be restored, reclaimed, this new civic space for the city of DC, and the future, the next phase of the city of Washington, DC. And Gail said, wait a minute. Before we get to the future, let's take a stock of the present. How did we get here as a city, as a waterway, as communities? And as the Anacostia Community Museum, we'd never really done an in-depth look at what is this body of water that shaped life, communities in this area for thousands of years. All right, so she's very intrigued by that. And really, this would be an environmental history. This would be, an environmental history that would really center the relationship between communities and their waterways, okay? And because there was a relationship, you had to approach it through multiple pathways. So yes, water quality is very important, but it sits in the context of daily life, right? So different pathways to engage in this waterway is faith, there's class, there's power, there's health, there's art, there's music, because the Anacostia really has been a dividing line in DC in multiple ways, not only in terms of race, but also access to various resources that contribute to healthy, sustainable local thriving communities. And so the idea was that this urban waterways project would be intersectional, break down silos not only of discipline, but also in terms of geography. Nothing exists in a vacuum, so the local is a reflection of national and international trends. So how we could replace DC and the Anacostia in conversation with sister communities in Pittsburgh, Louisville, Biloxi, LA, on Oahu, and London as well, just to name a few. And of course, then how do we engage our community partners in multiple ways? So as a museum, an exhibition is how we do most of our engagement. So after 2 years of research, community forums, dialogues, conversations, documentation, we really kind of opened up Reclaiming the Edge, Urban Waterways and Civic Engagement, as a way of engaging our community members in conversation around the Anacostia. When they stepped into our gallery spaces, they encountered familiar blue and green spaces, flora and fauna, but who are the people who have advocated and have had a deep connection to this waterway? How have we taken from the river over time, both tangible and intangible, and what are our next steps and possible ways forward? And so all through of this, it would not have been possible without the collaboration, the yes of our community partners. They give power to the work that we do. And in being in constant conversation, we were hearing not all of our partners, but many of them are saying, oh yeah, we think about the environment that way too, right? And then some are very explicit saying, oh no, we see this as an environmental justice issue. And this is how we define the environment, where we live, work, play, and learn. And by using that definition, it opens up environmental spaces. It acknowledges the different ways of being an environmentalist, to think about environment, and it pushes back against narratives that certain communities do not care, have been the problem, are not interested. We've come to learn through this definition that environmentalism is at the cornerstone of community histories, right? And how can you engage those histories and take a step back, saying the communities are the leaders because they live in these environments, they've been advocating, addressing these issues. We are coming in as a partner, wanting to convene with them, wanting to learn from them, and if they will allow us to, serve as a platform. And if they were not ready, that's fine, take a step back and we'll knock on your door again. So that's the way we've been thinking about environment over the past couple of years.
Yeah, thank you, Katrina. Again, Katrina is with the Anacostia Community Museum, and that is one way of defining a community around the environment that you share. But we wanted to talk about this very broad definition of what community can mean. Again, we think of these as connected organizations or individuals who share something. It could be living in the same place or a similar place. That's a common way of defining community, but it is certainly not the only one. You might also be collectively subject to the same jurisdiction. So you might be in the same homeowners association or in the same voting district within a community. You may have some other characteristic in common. People with blindness and low vision are a community. Students and alumni of a university are a community. We often talk about the Black and Brown communities as another way of thinking about a group of people who share a characteristic and who have shared interests. And the most broad definition of community that we typically use are this sense of fellowship given your common interests, your common goals, your common passions. So social justice activists are a community, whether or not they're focusing on issues of justice within the same zip code for the same demographic group, or are thinking in really dispersed ways. Environmental groups are also a community. A birding club can be a community. And here at the bottom of the slide, we have just a few different examples of what community-based organizations can entail. These are organizations that are really based in serving an interest of the community that they represent. Whether or not that's a parent-teacher association advocating for the needs of students at a school, or whether or not that's a faith-based organization that shares some common ethical and moral values that they want to take action on. We really use this term incredibly broadly because there's so many different ways of forming community and being in relationship with one another. And even though this has a very broad definition, I think a very key point that I'd love you to take away is that when you are talking about taking action with communities, it is important to be specific about which one of these things you are talking about. Community can have a broad definition, but when you are working to take action, that needs to be operationalized. You need to be clear and specific about who you're working with, who can authentically represent those voices and interests, and who are the partners that you intend to share leadership with. So, we'll take a minute here just to see if there are any questions folks have about these definitions of environment and community. And if there aren't questions from you, a question for all of you is what resonates with you or doesn't resonate with you about the ways that we've talked about environment and community here? Thank you for modeling standing your tent.
I think that, the word community, thank you so much for all the definitions, because a lot of times I'm sitting in a meeting and people are throwing it around. I'm like, wait, who are we talking about right now? I don't know what's happening. And I think that it's not normalized to define. I think everyone's like, oh, and it's like, who are we including and who are we leaving out? So I think that I love that you mentioned that it should be shared every time the word community is spoken, who exactly we're speaking about. Because in my opinion, I think that it's frequent that people that look like me are usually implied but actually not named, and so therefore end up getting left out when community is just like a broad word in my organization. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm trying to see if there's any other tent cards standing up. They're a little bit short. They're a little bit smaller than honestly we thought they were going to be. So, but I think we're working through it. Okay, I don't think I'm missing anyone, but if I'm failing to see your card, feel free to raise your hand as a backup. Awesome. All right, we're going to move to another set of definitions that we think, again, are important to be clear about so that you are being forthright up front and, again, clear about what you are intending to achieve through your work. So I'll pass it over to Rose.
Thanks, Laura. So we've started with environment and community as almost sort of the top tier of definitions. And then once you start to kind of hone in on what is the environment or community issues or topics focus areas, we thought this would be a useful kind of next level set of definitions to think through, really bridging from those initial concepts to the action you might take together. Really kind of thinking through these different dimensions can help think through what's the context, what's our role, what is the action that's appropriate for us. The first one, as the name suggests, with interdisciplinary, of course, is thinking about working across disciplines or weaving them together. I really like the definition, the metaphor of puzzle pieces here, because, of course, each discipline provides a different way of seeing the world, a different set of methods, assumptions, contexts for asking and answering questions. But rarely do those disciplines comprehensively cover all aspects that will be important for some real world problem. And for example, if it's a question of what do we do about persistent local flooding in a certain area of our jurisdiction, economics can tell you something about the costs, that the historical and projected costs. Meteorologists can tell you also about the weather patterns that have taken place and so on. But none of those really can answer the question, what do we do about this on their own? It's only once you start bringing together the various methods alongside, of course, different sets of values and perspectives and experiences that you can start to answer questions like that. So really putting together the various pieces of the puzzle. I think we'll pass now for the next term, intergenerational.
Thank you. So I always love a good quote. And I think it's really important to have people speak for themselves and to acknowledge the work of those who've come before us. And so These two quotes are from Zora Martin Felton, who basically developed and led the Education Department at Anacostia Community Museum for many, many decades, and also led much of our environmental work up through the early 1990s. And so I think what is so powerful about these two quotes is that they really acknowledge the important role of the youngest stakeholders that the museum was serving and has been serving over the past 5 or 6 decades. And it really kind of speaks to a recognition of the important role of all residents in the civic life of any community. And it really highlights a respect for the experience and views of youth. Most importantly, the mentorship that's needed to develop the next generation of leaders who will address critical issues in terms of envisioning, imagining a healthier, more sustainable future, an equitable future. Especially when you're thinking about the environmental issues that the museum has really kind of tackled over the years. I find that when the museum has been willing to be in conversation with its younger stakeholders, that's really where you really come to have a deep understanding of the issues really impact. Yes, everyone in the communities have been impacted. When we speak to the youth, you really see the ramifications of action and inaction. And that really stems from our very first, I would say, exhibition looking at an environmental issue in an urban setting was the Rat Man's Invited Affliction, came out of a focus group, a conversation with the elementary school students. And I can't get into the details, but it wasn't a moment where they sat them down and chastised them, how dare you do this? It was, okay, what's going on here? There's something, what's happening to cute pet white mice who are disappearing from the cages? What's really happening? And by the students feeling safe in that moment to share, well, this is what's going on at home, the educators realized, wait a second, this is a really deep issue. So at that moment, some of the neighborhoods east of the river were facing rat infestations. And so having been in conversation with the younger stakeholders, they said, as a museum, we cannot ignore this issue. So how do we address this? Let's try an exhibition. They went back to the students, okay, if we do an exhibition, you tell us, what do we need to share with the larger public? And so they were tracing the history of man's relationship with rats, but also bringing it up to the present. And because of this exhibition, it led to action on the part of various city federal officials. And so what could have been easily, oh, don't ever do that again. It was simply, okay, let's have a conversation, everyone. What's really going on here? And now how do we as a museum really react to that? What do we take away from this moment? Do we turn our backs? Do we ignore it? And there was pushback. Some people said, how dare you put our business on the streets like that? And John Kennard and staff responded and said, no. We serve the public, and we cannot ignore any issue that they bring into our home, into their home, into their space. So as a museum, we have an obligation to respond to, in various ways, a pressing issue. And that conversation with the youngest stakeholders led to action that really impacted and really kind of said work to solve a really pressing community issue. And so as we've moved forward over the years, up to the very present, this is how we've continued to engage our younger partners. And so these are images from the 2018 Women's Environmental Leadership Initiative that launched with a summit. And once again, we said this had to be intergenerational. It provided a way for the elders and leaders in these EJ spaces to meet next generation. And many of them said, I feel really energized from this. I feel really hopeful about who's coming next. And for our youngest participants, some of them were 14, 15, it gave them a chance to kind of see how leadership can be enacted. Right? To connect with a legacy of leadership, particularly in terms of women of color leading in environmental spaces, but they also got practical steps in terms of what are some next steps you want to do education? Is it your career pathway? Well, here's an internship that you can follow, or here's a program that you can connect to, or simply, here's my email, here's my number. If you want to talk some more, let's be in conversation. So this idea of respecting all members of a community that have a role to be civically engaged, how they most feel comfortable, and having the museum space as saying, yes, we're willing to be equal partners with you, regardless of how old you are, how tall you are, where you are in the conversation, because ultimately, we have to help to prepare you, to mentor you, to step into your leadership roles. And I think it's also a very brief reminder, I think, of how the power, importance of mentorship. And so many of the communities that we tend to work with happen to be communities of color. and this notion of mentorship, of care, of love, of seeing the individual and saying, yes, I see you, young person, and I know that you are the next step for us. So I want to talk to you. I want to mentor you. I want to make sure that you understand what you're stepping into, but also you can guide me as well too. That is really just kind of a natural understanding that, yes, I want to sit at the table with my elders and listen to the conversations and hear the jokes and hear the laughter, but at the same time, I'm picking up knowledge. I'm learning how to be a leader in a very kind of familial moment. And that's what we've tried to bring forth in our conversations and in our programming, but also in terms of how we reach out to respect our younger participants and our younger stakeholders.
Yeah, thank you, Katrina. So we've talked about interdisciplinarity. We've talked about intergenerational work. And I also just want to call attention to the importance of intersectionality when we are working with communities who are made up of individuals who are part of multiple communities and have multiple identities. So this term intersectional was first coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, whose photograph is up here on the slide. And it is really this analytical framework that considers how these multiple identities and multiple aspects of identity overlap and are related to systems of oppression, domination, or discrimination. And how we can examine these interlocking systems and their impacts on communities in order to analyze and address those inequalities that exist. So similar to Rose's point about interdisciplinarity work, bringing multiple necessary views on an issue in order to find the appropriate solution, intersectionality asks us not just to think about the different academic disciplines that are relevant, but the different social identities and systems of power that are important to consider when we aim to take action to resolve an issue or advance a priority. So the example we have here is thinking about the gender pay gap, which is often thought of as a feminist issue, but without thinking about the other social identities that impact wages, like race, immigration status, education level. We can think about solutions that might address one dimension of this issue in a pay gap, but not be considering other issues and cause harm or exacerbate different gaps based on our inclusion or non-inclusion of these other identities and other systems of power that are relevant and having an impact on what we are actually seeing play out in the world. So want to spend a little bit of time, again, in discussion with all of you. If you have questions for us, again, happy to take them at any time. But we do have some questions that we'd love you to weigh in on as well. We would love to hear what are some of the issues that your museum works on and how you think about interdisciplinarity, intergenerational work, and intersectional work as they apply to those issues that your museum is concerned with. And we want to think about what are your priorities and why are those priorities? So what are the issues that you are concerned about? How do you conceive of those different dimensions in that work? And how did you get to that place where you're thinking about that? And if you don't have, again, half thoughts are welcome. If you want to just share an issue that you're grappling with that you haven't necessarily completely solved, that is also 100% okay. Thank you. Thank you for being brave.
Sorry, I think about these things all the time. So I think that something that our museum is grappling with is not seeing the intersectionality. And I think it's really erasing a lot of opportunity. And, when I think about the outreach that we do to the queer community, I think about how it's not thinking about so many different identities within the queer community. Same with BIPOC community. And so while we do have for our strategic and operational plan, we have named intentionally to do, outreach and focusing on the community, the BIPOC community, specifically Black and African American, specifically Asian American and Asian, and then also LGBTQIA2S+. Yeah. I think that kind of says it. There's not a lot of intersectionality, even just in the way that we're speaking about it in our plan.
Yeah, thank you. Sort of acknowledging the lack of intersectionality is often the place that we have to start. And again, I think that speaks to this idea of being specific about who you're working with and who you're seeking to serve in order to be aware of, be cognizant, and build in those different dimensions of identity in your programming, in your strategy. Yeah, thank you, Rose, for pointing out these two cards.
I'm at the same organization as Alyssa. So to add on to that piece, I think that we are also struggling with intergenerational work. We do have a lot of programs for children and for youth. I think that the average age of most of our leadership and management, we're all between our 40s to mid 50s. And we are not engaging enough with the generations before us, so with the older generation. And we have heard comments, we've received feedback about them wanting to be seen and included and participating in our programs. And I was thinking specifically when we're doing our exhibit openings and closing celebrations that we are not intentionally including them into our programming, even when it's a subject that was actually built during their generation and that they were very much a part of. And so I made a note to myself to how do we start building intergenerational partnerships with those who are older than us, in addition to our youth.
Hello. So I'm at the Spencer Museum of Art at the University of Kansas. And so when we talk about interdisciplinary, there is a lot of stuff that we're doing across the university. But so I have a couple maybe like half thoughts. So one is that we do, I think, a good job, sort of like maybe what you were saying, of reaching different generations, but not together. So we have specific programs for elementary school engagement. We have a lot of very specific engagement for university classes, students, faculty. We have a program called Senior Sessions that is, quote, designed for older adults, but open to everyone. And so even like the staff who are responsible for those things we're small, so we collaborate a lot, but it's like, okay, if it's for like people under this age, education is handling it. If it's for people in the university academic programs, is handling it. And then we have a program called the Arts Research Integration Program. And its goal is sort of to bring in researchers, both faculty and students from across the university, to the museum, and also sort of like remind everyone that creating art is its own form of research. But something my colleagues and I have been talking about since we came here is that although it is integrated with the university as a whole, it's not integrated like within the museum with the other things we're doing in the museum. So I feel like we're doing a lot of these things, but we're not connecting them to each other.
Yeah, thank you. You might be considering all those different dimensions, but not actually intersecting them.
I'm Sydney. I'm also from the Spencer Museum, and I was thinking about the specific program that we have called Senior Sessions, which has attracted seniors from high school in the past because they thought it was for seniors. And I was actually thinking that might be a great opportunity if we like combined both this high school seniors and the seniors that show up for that program. I don't know where we'd put them because they are usually really full, but it's something that we might want to think about. And not my part of the museum.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely messaging, branding, how do you call yourself in those identities is also important to attracting folks and making sure that you're facilitating those spaces in ways that are welcoming.
Hey y'all. So I'm from a children's museum, and so it's easy to think about programming and our primary audience as elementary school kids, but including intergenerational as a definition, as a term, is helping me to think what other aspects of programming can I include so that I am thinking about a family who maybe has grandparents as the primary caregivers, and maybe they're coming, or maybe their kids are being raised by older siblings. So just thinking about different types of families and who I might be missing or just not thinking of when I'm putting together programs, or when I'm trying to engage with the kids in my face. Who are they going home to? Like, how can I make what we're doing together also connect to who they're going home with? So thank you for including that, because now my wheels are turning.
So happy to hear that. And we'll go to this table, and then we'll go back to the front. Saw your card up first.
Hi. I think maybe I have a half thought here. We are in the process of some remodeling of just the museum space itself. And we're a history, science, and culture museum. So we're kind of all over the place. Our primary audience is families with children, because we have an interactive science center. But one of the topics that came up, and this is all related to intergenerational, was we have kind of two different entrances and talking about, different tracks through the museum, a track for kids and families and a track for, more history seekers, maybe older adults. And one of the things that came up that just kind of struck me in all of this conversation is there was some conversation around, how do we separate the older people from the younger people? Meaning that the older people might be annoyed by the children playing and that sort of thing. And it just struck me, and this is why it's a half thought, a long half thought apparently, is, how short-sighted that thought is. That for the most older people that I've encountered enjoy children and enjoy that energy and what they bring to what might be solitary lives, or not as many things, or they had kids and they want to be excited to see kids or reminded of their grandkids or whatever. And I'm just trying to think of how we can bring that intergenerational conversation into maybe not making a misstep in this remodeling process to kind of separating groups, and rather how do we celebrate, older people interacting with younger people and vice versa, kind of learning from each other, as opposed to, if you don't want to deal with kids, go this way. If you want to have fun, go this way. And it just struck me as how maybe misguided that was. Oh,
thank you to the last two people. I think it just really sparked some thoughts. My name's AR. I'm with Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle, Washington. I think this is also a half thought. We've recently been fostering a relationship with a direct service organization. And I think one of the things I really appreciate about direct service organizations is they really tell you how it is in their communities. No, they're direct, and I love that. I forgot about it and just remembered today that one of our direct service organizations works closely with teen parents. And I think that's often an audience that we forget about, recognizing that these teens are still very much children themselves, and that they need programming, they need resources, they're wanting programming and resources, and often they're pushed to the side because they are already a parent. And so they fall within the gaps between being a child and being a parent. And then they still have their children that they're taking care of. And often they're living in intergenerational households where the teen's parent or grandparent is also in the picture, helping raise the young child. So I guess I'm just like, thank you, because like I totally forgot about that, and I think that's so important to remember, the complexity of people's experiences and lives.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that and reminding us all that, again, there's lots of different types of identities that we like to try to box people in, and yet there are still folks who don't fit neatly into those boxes.
My name is Patrice Melnick with the Opelousas Museum. We're a very small museum, and it occurs to me that one of the advantages of being small is that it's easy to do community-driven programming. So people will come to me and say, I want to honor our ancestor who made these accomplishments. And I say, okay, we're going to help you plan this event, and we do the PR for them. But just naturally, they bring in their families. They bring in the children because they want them to see this. And it's a privilege to be able to help them celebrate what they feel is important. And so that's one thing I'm glad for.
My name is Sadie. I'm in Oklahoma. And being... one of the things that struck me when I moved to the U.S. was that churches had a strict separation in between the ages, and while in the places that I grew up with, elders intersected with children, and it was part of the norm, and so that things also affects the way we think in programming and the different activities, because we want to separate people in ages, which if you're coming from a collectivist culture, that is different. And so that I believe that it affects in the way we think. And so in my realm of programming, I have been able to share that it's okay to have kids being part of a program. And so, for example, I'm currently collaborating to develop Juneteenth, the Juneteenth celebration, from a historical perspective. And so part of the program, it's bringing a group of kids under 5th grade to share their perspective about what they understand about Juneteenth, not from the academia perspective, but from the children's perspective. And so some of the people that I planned the program with are probably retired teachers or people, high scholars with this academia thinking, and they want to give the professional, the big story behind it, but not understanding what the child sees. It's hard to continue the work, and if we want to be sustainable, then we also got to think of how the children are seeing it, and so that's something that I'm working on as to closing the gap between generations. And me being Hispanic, telling that it's important for me to also understand what the history of Juneteenth is. I am also sharing that knowledge with the rest of the communities I work with, because we are only stronger if we work together. And the more we see the patterns in different demographics, the more we're going to appreciate the work that has been done already, so that we can intersect in our own experiences.
Just a quick thought. Thank you for all of your thoughts. AR, I just wrote down teen parent program. Yes. I'm at the same organization as Shauna, Children's Museum. And I just wanted to share a comment that one of our education staff once made. She used to run sort of like our Baby and Me program. And then she became a mother herself and kind of, struggled with it. And she said to me once, she's like, I would do that totally different. Like, it's not about the baby. The baby's fine. Like, how's the mom? How's the dad? This is a big change. And, you know, people go through postpartum depression and things like that. And so I think just sharing an anecdote to think about, you know, how are we meeting all of the needs and who is actually at your museum? You know, yeah, we're a children's museum, but the children don't come by themselves. So like, how are we really thinking about all of those needs?
Hello, I'm Prerna, and I work down the street at the Minnesota Museum of American Art, and I'm thinking of a few things that are not half thoughts, but parts, half questions that I'm thinking about. Like, number one is, like, I think for me, the framework feels critically important to be like, what are some of the issues my museum should be thinking about, as it relates to like current events, as it relates to like not just responses we're getting from the community, but like how we're addressing it within the museum. And I'm particularly thinking about like what's happening in Gaza to the Palestinian people, and like kind of a lack of language or space to like discuss that, not just within our museum as a staff, and not for any particular reason, but also I think there's like some kind of fear to be thinking about within that. And I think then I'm thinking about how that to me is the highest priority. And while we're still developing intersectional programming, I think, you know, there's a lot of ask that's coming from the community, understandably so, about like how we respond to this. And I think there's maybe a notion that like as cultural touchstones and spaces, that not speaking about something is kind of taking a neutrality stance and apolitical. But I am really thinking about how not talking about it is incredibly political and not neutral at all. That said, though, I'm also thinking about on the upside, as it relates to programming in our museum, we have a show up right now that is co-curated by a local artist and his kid, who said that they wanted to be in a museum show, and when can they do that? And he said, maybe when you're a mid-career artist like me, you could be at the Walker or the Minneapolis Center for Art or whatever. And she said, well, I don't know why I have to wait till I'm 35 or 40 to do that. I want it now. And so he approached us to see if we would do like a show of parent artists in the Twin Cities and their kids working together in collaboration, or sometimes not, independently. And a lot of what I was thinking about too was what someone said over there about like signage, because, you know, it's like interactive. Like one of the pieces are like, it's a place piece, so you can go into it that the parent and the kid has created. But we're also making signs that say like, okay, you can go here and not exactly, but have fun, or you can go there where like the more regular, boring museum stuff is. But I think that was like a great program that we didn't come up with it by any means, but are so glad that maybe we are a smaller museum and have kind of like maybe our lower stakes in being for like local artists to come and approach to do programming like this, to do exhibitions like this. So yeah, I think I'm thinking a lot about like, how are we positioning ourselves as museums, like what that looks like in terms of like what kind of microcosm is a museum? Like what are we perpetuating is something I'm thinking about a lot. And like regardless of like how big or small a museum is, like how the word museum in and of itself can like kind of perpetuate a kind of hierarchy, a kind of government, a kind of like state-like approach, and how that kind of gets in the way of like some of these important questions that you're bringing up about how do we, you know, where are the intersectional, interdisciplinary, what are the priorities, and like how are we talking about these things that are like people look to us to talk about, and like if we can't do it, then who's going to do it?
Yeah, thank you so much. You've touched on, I think, something especially in the science center and science museum world we think about a lot in terms of being neutral, but also being an expert. And those are really hard things to balance, and sometimes not the balance you need to strike in order to be responsive to needs and be responsive to what's actually happening in the world. So interrogating that, letting go of some of your expertise in leadership in order to share that with the community, but also having an awareness, leveraging the expertise that your staff has in order to make some of those positive differences.
Thank you. I wanted to just go back to what Sadie was saying earlier about the experiences around churches and different institutions that separate generations, including our own. And one of the big things that I kind of took from what you're saying is that in a lot of communities, it is actually the cultural practice and norm is to have intergenerational spaces and to be connected. So when we are separating those things or compartmentalizing or saying that practice is not welcome, we're sending a message to those communities also that your culture might not be welcome here, or we're not going to adapt or change our practices to meet the needs of your community.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives. I'm walking through the tables and seeing if there's anybody else I missed, but I'm not seeing any other tent cards standing on their end. So I just want to say once again, thank you all for sharing from your experiences, from your histories, because I know it's sometimes challenging to be reflective and be open in a room full of people who you may not know very well. But I think we're all really benefiting from hearing from the different experiences that are being brought to this room. So with that, we want to take a little break. We'll take just a quick 5-minute break, grab some water, use the restroom, stretch your legs, and come back. But then we'll continue the conversation and continue sharing stories from other museum professionals.
All right, we're going to try to proceed. Could wrap up that last conversation. We have another break coming. Next, we're going to dive a little bit into kind of the crux of what I think drew many people to this particular workshop, which is talking about action. And what is it exactly, and the role of relationship building as well. When I searched for images of action, these are the kinds of things that came up. They're dramatic, they're visible, they're dynamic. There's just a lot of movement and verbs taking place. There's direction and often linearity implied in a lot of action. And I think these are the kinds of things we do tend to think about when we envision action. And certainly they are action. And for the purposes of today and the way we're thinking about action on racial justice and other social issues, we also want to think about some of the less visible, dramatic, dynamic types of things, and in particular, relationship building as both an action in itself and a potential stepping stone to some of those more visible, dynamic, goal-oriented types of action. But depending on what our goals are, if it's really increasing mutual understanding, helping people or specific communities to be seen and validated and have roles to play, more active roles to play in various kinds of community decision-making, then some of these less intense versions of action, the things that help us build relationships over time, are as important or more important in some cases. And so we take relationship building as the starting point for a wide range of actions, and want to kind of encourage that as some of the critical first inputs. Next, we'll kind of talk about institutional context and roles. So I will pass over to Laura. No? Yes. Okay, thank you. Actually, Katrina, I think yours is coming. Okay. I can talk through this one. Thank you. Sorry, a few too many handoffs here. So bridging in from relationships into the institutional context is thinking about where your institution's history and relationships have been and currently are, And then taking stock of what those mean for your priorities and your potential roles. So understanding kind of how the institution has engaged on an issue with a particular community in the past, understanding what has gone well, what hasn't, what have we learned, what are some of the factors that have contributed to various outcomes, and then what assets, expertise, experience your institution can contribute, but also the flip side is what do you still need to learn? What are the other perspectives and expertise to bring in? How might you do that? And then on an ongoing basis, how will you navigate challenges as well? These are just a few kind of sample questions that can inform really just a taking stock of where your institution currently is. One specific potential method as well is doing sort of a pre-mortem. It sounds a little bit morbid, and I guess actually slightly is, because it's a strategy for proactively addressing challenges that might arise. And it starts with this opening premise. Imagine that your project is completed and it was a failure. You can define failure in lots of different ways, and in fact, you're encouraged to do so. So is it that you now have larger rifts in your community on a specific issue? Is it that the project just didn't go anywhere? It kind of stalled. There are many different forms of failure, but this exercise encourages you to list them. What would all those different versions of failure look like? And for each, kind of walk through what did it look like? What went wrong? What went awry? Sort of what did the process look like that led you to that failure? And now, because your project actually isn't over, you can say, what are some of the things that we could do to make sure this failure doesn't happen, that this set of conditions is not met? And list those out. And as you go through the various failures, you kind of start to come up with a set of norms, routines and processes, safeguards perhaps, that will help you ensure that those failures are not met. I've also heard many people find it helpful to revisit their pre-mortem regularly throughout their process, as it gives you a chance to say, ooh, is one of these failure scenarios starting to sound a little bit too close to the current reality? Or are we doing these safeguards or these things we put in place? Or do we need different ones, perhaps recalibrating throughout? So this is just one potential exercise to start doing some of that kind of taking stock and thinking through the relationship building strategies. Now I will pass to you, Katrina. Thanks. Sorry.
Problem. All right, so we start off again with two other quotes from John R. Kennard, who was the founding director of the then Anacostia Neighborhood Museum. And I don't want to say it was the word in awe, but I greatly admire and respect not only, for example, Mr. Kennard, Miss Martin Felton, because they were in a cohort of staff and colleagues at what were predominantly Black and brown cultural institutions in the late 60s, early 70s that were really calling out mainstream museums in their failures. And museums were asking, why is no one visiting us? What's going on? And they got together and said, well, no, you're not serving us. When we walk into your hallways, we don't see ourselves. And if you can't teach our children anything about who they are, who they could be, then we have no use of you. Right? They were very, very adamant, you are failing in your obligations to large society. And two quotes I think really just beautiful and powerful. People have a driving desire to know more about themselves, their history, and their environment, as well as others who inhabit distant lands and whose cultures and lifestyles are so very different from their own. They hunger and thirst for knowledge upon which to build a better society, but are shown relics of the past that are lacking in meaningful interpretation, seem not to connect with their heritage, their more pressing concerns of the moment, or their hopes and dreams of the future. When one considers that museums, like other great institutions that educate the public, are also influenced by external stimuli and change society, then they have both the responsibility and the opportunity to enhance the way that we perceive ourselves, the manner in which we interact socially and culturally. They can inspire and bring into focus our dreams and hopes for a better future. So, the Smithsonian Institution was one of the large institutions having these worries and conversations, right? So we have visitors down the mall, everyone's visiting us, but local communities and you can interpret what local is meaning, are not coming to visit us. So why not open a neighborhood museum, right, that would encourage people to get to know us a bit better, feel comfortable, they don't feel intimidated, and come down the mall to visit us. So obviously, these were the conversations that John Kennard and the museum staff were having with the residents of historic Anacostia before the museum even opened. These conversations do not reflect a museum that's simply a vestibule, a waiting room for the largest Smithsonian institution, right? So before the museum actually opened its doors in '67, there's the Carver Theater. This is Mr. Kennard standing. This is the hero shot from a local theater. They were asking residents, people, like, what is this museum for you? How will this space serve your needs? And so they understood before the doors even opened in this wonderful celebration that this is a space that when we step in, we meet ourselves. It's a place of celebration. However, we will also speak very honestly about our realities. So it's a space that was really an extension of community, right? As your veranda, your front porch, your front lawn, to have these conversations. And museum staff would stand in the present to look to the past. How do we come to this moment in our lives? What are the lessons we can bring forward from the past? And then what futures can we envision, right? And museum staff standing with residents to envision possible futures, and the museum space being this convening space, being a resource, but it's active, right? You're not walking in, it's not hush, it's like, well, okay, so this is nice, but what does it have to do with my life? You walk in, you feel this energy, and oh my goodness, yes, I see myself, but I also see possibilities for the future. And so it really is living up to these ideals that Mr. Kennard really put forth in these writings. There's an obligation to serve and to educate, and how can the museum really act as a fully vibrant civic space? And that is something that, I think has really been a part of all of this work, especially our environmental work over time. So this is an image of Miss Zora Martin Felton in the garden of students. So she started the first gardening program at our museum. We have a new one as well now. So this is a science project that started as a summer program to keep the students engaged, and it kind of extended over time. And this is an image from the rat exhibition that the students really were the root cause of, and helped to kind of collaborate and help to kind of interpret and put together. But this is really one of my favorite shots. Such a moment here, just to have a moment with Zora. She was at her heart an environmentalist, but also an educator, right? And when you meet a born educator, you know it. And she loved her community, she loved her students. And when you read what she wrote in her plans in terms of building the education department, you get it. She understood her role was to serve in the larger context. So that's my moment with Zora. And so as we've continued to build our programming, this is something that we've been guided by, that Dr. Gail Lowe, who built Urban Waterways, I continued to work after she passed in 2015. How are we really thinking about ongoing conversations in the museum and its extended spaces being civic spaces? And so the exhibition Reclaiming the Edge opened up due to conversations, collaboration with our external partners, but the exhibition closed, but the conversations continued in different forms. So yes, we did have focus groups, community forums, and just to mention community forums, we weren't on stage, right? We invited community partners who had differing opinions or views from a different environmental issue. We were either in the back or taking notes in the audience. If we were on stage, it was because the moderator couldn't make it, right? And then it would open up this larger conversation with community partners. Conversation also took the form of oral histories, a photographic documentation, and really just kind of listening and watching to the work that was being done. And I was taking notes subconsciously, I think, of how many women I was meeting in these spaces who were leading, thinking about environment in different ways, different communities, different experiences. Some had been in the movement for like 40 years, others were in career, others were just starting out, others were in high school thinking, well, I heard about this program, I thought I'd come and find out what it was about. And so in 2018, I remember December 2018, the American Women's History Initiative was launched at Smithsonian. And it's, by the way, we have funding for you. What are you doing for next March? And I remember I knocked on our then director's office door, Lori Yaris. I said, Lori, I have this crazy idea. Why not bring all the women who we've been working with in these environmental spaces together for conversation to see what could come out of this network? So have them meet as professionals, yes, but as people. Who am I? What communities do I represent? Why do I do this work? And how do I do this work? And meet around the themes of mentorship, education, training, and then leadership. I'm thinking 25 people downstairs, Panera in the program room. And Lori challenged me. I'll never forget her for doing this. She said, well, why not 100 women? Why not downtown in the heart of the Smithsonian? So that's how the Women's Leadership was launched 2018 for a summit where we would convene this living, breathing network of experts to share the realities of doing this work, but to provide examples of how the work could be done. So 60 women the first time, the panels in the morning, workshops in the afternoon, and the next day was really about a community forum where we had over a century of expertise on that panel. I was in the back of the room, and this is where this idea of always being in conversation and always being in engagement with our community partners really pays off, because this was the moment where I felt the shift from urban waterways, where it was a reminder, no, Katrina, it's not just the waterways, it's everything else. The waterways is a piece of the larger puzzle about environment and justice and equity. And we asked these women, who are your mentors? Who have shaped your pathway? And they changed, they lit up, they got soft. And I'm listening to the people they're mentioning. I'm like, wait a second. Like this is the justice movement across 20, 30, 40, 50 years. These women are living, breathing history, and we can touch them. We can speak to them. We can laugh with them. We can have a meal with them. I thought, okay, these histories have to go beyond this moment. Who needs to be in the room? And that's how the Well Basic Initiative pushed us to the next phase of this really is about a justice movement connected to the other justice movement. And women have played a really key role in this. But how is this instructive? How does this move beyond a summit that's a day and a half? And so that was the point where we thought about how do we push this out to our younger partners, but thinking about oral histories, publications, but really being willing to be led by the expertise of the women in that room, right? That wasn't coming from from ACM. Yes, we've done our work and research and documentation, but the power of that moment, the knowledge, the legacy, the possible next steps was really emanating from everyone gathered in that room. And so how would we as an institution respond to that? And being willing to say, okay, you know what? We were simply inspired, but let's take that inspiration and move into the next phase of how our work can live beyond our museum walls. So this notion of museums as civic spaces are active, but it really is about this idea of all these voices come together in this community space as we define community, to think about conversation is wonderful. It really makes us buzz. It makes us energized. But what do we do beyond this moment? And we understood that networks that came out of this first summit didn't matter if we were part of the conversation. Didn't really matter. Those networks were formed, they were reinforced, or if internships came out, which they did, we were simply being the conveners, but in that very moment we got it. It was, oh, wait a minute, this is a turning point, and this was made possible through the willingness of the women to be a part of this conversation, to share their expertise. So thinking about museum as a civic space can take many forms and shapes, and actually the summit took place beyond the museum space because we're a small space, but really thinking on this notion of what does it mean to be in constant conversation and be willing to calibrate, take a step back, change direction and path, and how that can really reshape an entire institution or an entire program and how we approach issues that we're kind of engaging in the larger world. And just want to finish this off, I just want to kind of share, this is a quote from that second summit that we did for 2019, a response by one of our attendees. And, you know, I've widened my circle for peer support. The summit also boosted my confidence, being around other women of color in particular, to keep being in the space and challenging. I learned about new legal approaches in challenging disparities and inequities. So yes, a practical application. I learned legal practices to move forward in my work, but also the impact on the human doing this very kind of, doing this justice work. And so we ask the questions, are we doing the work properly? What's wrong? What works for you? What doesn't work? But this is an indication of how, by taking a step back and allowing the experts to kind of take the lead, this is the impact we can have on the people who are coming to our spaces. Okay? And so now we have some questions of you. All right. This is a shot from our EJ Academy. You'll hear about them in a second. So in what ways are museums ideal spaces for civic and community work? What can that look like in different types of museum spaces? What are we asking of ourselves as we undertake this role? How do we build healthy partnerships that lead to success? So those are the questions that we want to kind of engage in the next couple of minutes, take some time to kind of mull it over. So wherever you want to start in this list of questions, whatever speaks to you, or other questions that you may have. And don't forget to raise your tents. I'll try to keep track of everything. Okay, our first tent up.
Joetta Velasquez from Museum of Pop Culture. I lead our events team. We work in partnership with our public-facing programs and education teams and community engagement. And the question that really sticks out to me is, what are we asking of ourselves as we undertake this role, and how do we build these healthy partnerships that lead to success? How do we balance and prioritize supporting the community and providing space for civic community work with the capacity within our own teams? Events, programs, as you know, require a lot of support from internal staff, which is also connected to dollars and impacts our budgets. So that's one of our big challenges, is managing capacity and financial resources to be able to provide what we want to provide for our community partners. So not necessarily a question, just a thought that this is a big challenge for us, and I am assuming that probably a challenge for many others as well.
Anyone else wants to respond to that? Just an idea or thought, because I started to nod right away, because capacity. So just to quickly add something to that. So yes, we are Smithsonian, but we're in the smallest units, right? And so the largest team for this work over the years has been at most 3, usually 2, and also 1 most of the time. And in terms of, yes, dollars, right? So we've been fortunate. We've had grants, internal grants and so forth. But, it's this kind of like you're dashing to put the show together. You're holding your breath most of the way that it works out, and it does. But capacity really is, for us, also has been a challenge. And so we reached a stage now where we're building out our team. But that speaks to, yes, we have all these great intentions, but as an institution, do we have the capacity across the board to do this? And if not, how are we careful of not making promises that we can't keep? But okay, we can't do this right now, but what can we do in the meantime to build toward that step? So yes, wrestling with that at various levels across the board. So yes, the name Smithsonian Institution, but within our own organization, that really has been a back and forth, right? Because you know the need, and it's a great idea, and oh my God, yes, the excitement around it. But of course, how do we make this work, right? And then saying, okay, not yet. Let's put it on the back of the stove and let it bubble for a bit, but keep your eye on it. And that really is hard sometimes, right? Because it's the mission and you see the importance of it, but it's the reality of hitting that wall. So, okay, we just can't right now. Yeah. Other responses and other comments to either that comment or other in the back here? Am I missing? Okay, so pass this one to you.
Thank you. Oh, wow. Our table has a lot to say, I think. I just wanted to address that first question a little bit, in which ways are museums ideal spaces for civic community work. So I feel like at our institution, we're an art museum, and I think one of the things we do really well is to use our collection to frame difficult conversations and to kind of open up space for people to talk in a way that might be hard to do in other places. And I've seen this a lot with the work that we do, especially with university students, because we are an academic institution on a university campus. But now I'm thinking about, how can we take that, what I think is a pretty solid framework, and expand it to other communities that we're not currently reaching. And I really appreciate the comment from this table earlier about working with direct service organizations. And that's an idea that had not crossed my mind before. So now I'm thinking about how can we build relationships with those folks and maybe open up our space to be a place where people can come and have difficult conversations, or use something in our collection to open up a way of talking that they might not currently have space for. So thanks for that.
Something that came up for me is just the idea of museum staff participating in community service outside of the museum. So when we're talking about fostering relationships and them being sustainable and not just transactional or episodic, like, what if we just have opportunities, we share opportunities for us to go and serve the other organization? Like, thank you for partnering with us for our project, but now let's have a group of us go to your event and support your initiative by just being another body and another set of hands to help you do your work as well. And maybe that could be a model for sustainability and growing that community, and then, reaching other generations, all this stuff that we've been talking about. Maybe, I know, again, capacity and time and all of that, but, maybe if it's just a quarterly, physically just going on your own time, yes, representing your institution, but just showing their community that, hey, we're here for you too. It's not just come to us. It's a mutually beneficial partnership.
This is the first time I feel like that, we really have something that we could add to the conversation, but being that our museum is a house museum, but based off of a woman who committed her life to civic engagement and civic activation and worked to build up other community leaders. So looking at our context of, being a space of convening and holding space for other groups, but also engaging with other groups who are doing civic engagement work, and helping to let them know that we are walking alongside them. But then also, I think what can I look like in different museum spaces is just looking at what are our assets, what do we have access to, but then also in collaboration with other partners, how can we make it lighter on ourselves as far as like the capacity piece, because we only have one person who is staffed there at the museum, and then we have a board, a volunteer board, and so. But if we're able to collaborate with other organizations within the city, that makes lighter work for all of us to be able to do that. And so thank you.
And let's see.
Looking at that first question, and maybe I'm having a pre-mortem in my own mind here, I think it goes hand in hand with recognizing that not everybody in the community feels like your museum is for them. And so, yes, we can talk about how are we ideal from a perspective of capacity, operations, et cetera, to be spaces for community work. But before we get to that point, how do we work on any perceptions that this museum isn't for somebody who looks like me? And having those conversations at the same time, I think, is really important to do, because ideally a museum, I heard on Monday the term cornerstone was described as an ideal for a museum. And I think that's a good start, but I'd prefer the term keystone. And a keystone is the stone that holds everything together. And so if you want to position your museum as a keystone in the community, you want to make sure everybody feels welcome there and feels like it's a place for them. And just to repeat myself a third time, I think that goes hand in hand with that first question.
Thank you. And then over here. Excuse me. There's someone. Here you go.
My name is Nia, and I work at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. We're a contemporary art museum. And I help lead the public programs at the museum. So I'm thinking a lot about these questions, and this really excites me. And the questions that have been sticking with me here are like, what are we asking of ourselves as we undertake this role, and how do we build healthy partnerships? And from doing a lot of collaborative work, both with the attendees who come into our museum, I've been focusing a lot on participatory programming, what that looks like, and also building partnerships with other arts and cultural institutions in our neighborhood and the larger Bay Area. And healthy partnerships take a long time. They take a lot of years, and a lot of both emotional investment, capacity investment from staff. And so I think a lot about just the timelines that we prescribe to ourselves, that leadership prescribes to museums, that part of what we have to ask ourselves about taking on these roles is like, are we actually accountable to the work? Knowing that we will probably slow our timelines down. We will be kind of making trades of what our priorities are if we are to do this work intentionally. So I'm thinking about like, what does that actually look like in practice? Working across different leadership levels, working across departments. If we're serious about this work, I think we have to be doing it very meaningfully in order to actually create beneficial co-collaborative relationships with our community versus things that feel extractive or superficial. So I don't have a solution yet. I have seen some success with some of our participatory programs, and I like creating spaces like we have an open mic night where our community is actually coming in and they're the ones creating the content for the program. We aren't the ones creating, putting a presenter up on a stage. I facilitate this space. I open up the space for people. But they're the ones, our visitors are the ones who are actually creating the thoughts and sharing the thoughts in this space. And so I'm trying to think of other models like that, where our community actually feels like they're having a voice and a say in what is going on at the museum.
So I'm going to refer to the first question as to in what ways are museums ideal spaces for civic and community work. In all of it, museums are all ideal spaces for civic and community work. And one of the topics right now during in every campaign, it's immigration. And most of the time we focus on what we're missing rather on what we have. And in all of our spaces, in all of our regions, we have immigrants who are contributing to the community. And I think we need to highlight the contributions of those immigrants that we have in our region. And from that point, they will feel seen, and it will automatically create this effect of, oh, I am welcomed, I am accepted. And so it doesn't have to be we don't need to focus on the what we're missing, but instead of what we already have. And that itself creates a space for civic and community work, in my opinion.
Thank you. That's very close to what I was going to say, but you said it way better. I can say that right now. I think that it's a lot of what needs to happen even before we start building the relationships, before we start like creating the strategy, is like a reframe of mindset, like you're speaking to, because I think that and I believe Joetta and I work at the same organization, Museum of Pop Culture. There is like a tendency to go into a scarcity mindset where it's like, oh, we don't have enough time. But I think you had said lists of assets, and that really resonated with me, because it's like, if we can start with what we know we have and what we are able to do, then it might give opportunity for a reframe so that it can make space to get to the other things that we can do and bring authenticity into the work that we're doing, rather than coming from a place of lack. We might find opportunity. We might find more connection and cohesion, and be able to find the humanity of that. Like, I know that, I think that Nia had mentioned around the building relationships and taking the time, but until we can list the assets that we have and understand that, we're not going to be able to build those relationships in our organization and take that time and understand the value of that. Because the whole time we're going to think, we don't have enough time, we're behind, we have, everyone's tired or whatever, we have a bunch going on in the museum, so it'll give us the space to reframe. So I just want to thank everybody for this conversation, because I was able to get there in my mind.
Anything? I think that's sorry.
Hello, my name is Jackie. I come from the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Something that's really sitting with me in this moment is how you said we call ourselves experts of human rights work, but we remain neutral. And we hold these things, this program that we call Critical Conversations. I think our next one is about AAPI hate. Or we'll have one about Black lives, or we'll have one about incarceration or what have you. We have these really hard conversations, but we have them at, in some ways, a very highbrow setting where it's just panelists and an audience watching. And this is getting me to think about, how do we allow smaller spaces to invite community members to have these conversations with us, with a facilitator, with a moderator, with an expert, so that even if the museum is not ready to name the things, we at least provide a space so that they know that we are there. Despite the fact that, our stakeholders or whoever is not ready to say where we are. So it's something that's really sitting with me today. You're with me? We're colleagues. We keep giving passing glances at each other So thank you guys for implanting those thoughts and kind of giving way to allowing, I guess how we've been saying all day, a way to go around, but still do the work in a way that the community feels seen, heard, understood, despite the fact that we can't stand up and really say the things that we should be saying. So yeah, thank you.
That one? Okay. All right. So another round of questions, and one last question before we move ahead. How can museums thoughtfully partner with, share leadership with, and center communities? Sit with that for a second. Is that a card I see now? Okay.
Hi, I think mine may be like a piggyback actually more of what you just said, but I can't stop it now. So I come from basically a pretty much municipal museum, and there are bureaucratic and political constraints, right? But we are still a museum, and we still have our nonprofit wing, which lets us get away with things. That's kind of our scapegoat in some ways. But I was thinking about the idea of how to have non-municipal civic discourse within our space. Like our city's civics academy comes to our museum as part of their training in what civics means. But then hearing you talk, and now I'm thinking about how can we use that opportunity and then put on our nonprofit hat and maybe have circles and have a different way of having people actually have real conversations about what is happening in our community and how it impacts them, rather than being yay waste management, when they which is really cool. You should go see your waste management. I don't discount that. But I think that's giving, I don't want to say me subversive